Anyone who has ever stood at Goodwood when a BRM V16 comes up the hill remembers the sound. Not a roar, a scream. 16 tiny cylinders climbing to a pitch no other engine has ever reached, a noise that raises the hair on your neck and rings in your ears long after the car is gone. Built by the finest firms in Britain, the engineers of the Spitfire's Merlin lending their genius, 160 companies pouring in their pride. It was meant to beat the Germans and the Italians who had humbled Britain before the war. It survived austerity, rationing, a nation counting out its bread by the ounce. It survived years of delay and a mountain of scorn. And then, after everything the country had poured into it, this screaming masterpiece never won a single championship race. Not one. How does the greatest sound in motor racing end up as a car that never won? What went so wrong inside those walls? Chapter 1. The scream and the silence. You hear it before you see it. On a summer afternoon at Goodwood, up the narrow tree-lined hill that runs past the great house, something begins to build in the distance, a sound unlike any other engine ever made. Not a roar, not a bark, a scream. 16 tiny cylinders spinning towards the far edge of what metal can survive, climbing and climbing until the note tears at the air itself, and every head on that hillside turns at once. Grown men who have heard 10,000 racing engines will tell you, quietly, that they have never heard anything like it. And then it is gone over the crest, and the hill rings for a moment with the memory of it. Now travel 40 miles south and west to the National Motor Museum at Beaulieu, and stand in front of the same kind of car when the engine is cold and still. Pale green paint, slender body, a machine no bigger than a family hatchback of today. It sits behind its rope in a silence so complete you can hear the building's ventilation. Doug Hill, who has kept this car alive for decades and who knows its every temper, will start it for you only rarely, and only with ceremony, because there is very little of it left in the world, and because the sound once heard does not leave you. John Owen, whose family saved the whole enterprise, put it more simply. The fabulous noise of that engine, he said, still rings in his ears 70 years on. Here is the paradox at the heart of everything that follows. This car made perhaps the greatest sound in the history of motor racing, and it never won a single championship Grand Prix. Not one. That is the tragedy, in a sentence. A war-weary nation poured its pride and its finest engineering into a screaming 16-cylinder wonder that was meant to beat the world, and built instead a machine that humiliated itself on the start line before it ever had the chance to win. It was too clever. It was too complicated. It was too powerful for its own components and too violent for the men brave enough to drive it. And it was, from the very beginning, designed not by one determined mind, but by a committee. That last fact would matter more than any other. But to understand how the dream curdled, you have to understand why the dream was dreamed at all. You have to go back to a Britain that no longer exists, grey, exhausted, rationed to the bone, and desperate to prove to itself that it could still make something the rest of the world would envy. The story begins there. Chapter 2. A Nation in the Grey. Imagine Britain in the years just after the war ended. The bunting had long since come down. Victory had been won and paid for, and the paying had not stopped. This was the age of austerity, and austerity in those years was not a slogan, but a daily fact, measured out in ounces. Bread had never been rationed during the war itself. It was rationed in 1946, after the fighting was over, a humiliation that would have seemed unthinkable during the Blitz. The winter of 1947 arrived like a punishment. Weeks of snow, frozen coal stocks, power cuts that shut factories and left families huddled in the dark. Then came the money. In September 1949, the pound was devalued at a stroke, from just over $4 American to $2.80. The nation that had stood alone against Hitler was now, in the plainest financial terms, close to broke, carrying a national debt at its highest since the wars against Napoleon. The government's answer was 2 words, printed on posters and repeated in every ministry: export or die. Every ton of steel, every skilled toolmaker, every hour of precision machining was supposed to go towards goods that could be sold abroad for hard currency. Nothing was to be wasted on frivolity. And into this world of make do and mend, of powdered egg and darned socks and the queue outside the butcher's, a small group of men proposed to build something gloriously, defiantly frivolous, a Grand Prix racing car. To understand why anyone thought that mattered, you have to remember what had happened on the racing circuits of Europe in the years before the war. There, Britain had been not merely beaten, but embarrassed. The German teams, Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union, the so-called Silver Arrows, had arrived at the great races backed by the resources of a state that wanted to prove its superiority in steel and speed. They were faster than anything Britain could field by a margin that was not close. British gentlemen in their green cars had been lapped, humbled, sent home. National pride, the kind that lives in the chest rather than the ledger, had taken a wound that had never quite healed. And here is the strangest number of the period. For all its poverty, Britain in 1950 was still the largest exporter of motorcars on earth, sending something close to a quarter of all the cars sold in the world. The country could build vehicles. What it had never done, not once, was build a car that could beat the Germans and the Italians at the very top of international motorsport. That gap between a nation that made cars for the world and a nation that could not win the world's greatest races was an itch that one man in particular could not stop scratching. His name was Raymond Mays, and he believed, with a conviction that bordered on the religious, that Britain could and should build a car to beat them all. Not a car built by a rich amateur in a shed, a national car, a car that carried the honour of the whole country under its bonnet. It was never, in his mind, just a car. That was both the making of the project and, in the end, its undoing. Chapter 3. The Charmer of Bourne. Raymond Mays was born on the 1st of August, 1899, in the small Lincolnshire market town of Bourne, in a comfortable house on Eastgate. His father was a prosperous wool merchant and fertiliser manufacturer, and the young Mays grew up with money, connections, and an almost theatrical sense of his own destiny. He was sent to Oundle School, where he met a gifted and eccentric engineer named Amherst Villiers, a man who would later build superchargers, and who was immortalised by his friend Ian Fleming when Fleming gave James Bond a supercharged Bentley tuned by Amherst Villiers. From Oundle, Mays went to Christ's College, Cambridge, with a spell in the Grenadier Guards in France in between. What Mays truly was, beneath the education and the charm, was a showman. One profile in the motoring press caught him exactly. Ray was always dramatic, it said. He certainly loved cutting la bella figura, cutting a fine figure, making the entrance, holding the room. He was a hill climb star and a Brooklands hero in the 1920s, campaigning cars with names that sounded like racehorses. 2 Bugattis he called Cordon Bleu and Cordon Rouge, a monstrous Vauxhall Villiers, and the famous White Riley that pointed the way to everything that came next. He was, in the language of the day, a gentleman driver, and he moved through the drawing rooms of the great and the good with an ease that money alone could not buy. He was also a homosexual man at a time when that could send you to prison, and he carried that private life through a public world with a discretion that must have cost him something we can only guess at. But his social gifts, the letters, the lunches, the ability to make a captain of industry feel that backing Raymond Mays was the most natural thing in the world. Those gifts would become the actual engine of the project, not the pistons, the connections. In 1933 and 34, at Bourne, Mays had co-founded a racing car company called English Racing Automobiles, ERA, with a wealthy backer named Humphrey Cook and a designer named Peter Burton. The ERAs were good cars, and they made Britain competitive in the smaller racing classes. But they never touched the top tier, the Grand Prix cars, the giant killing machines. And that, for Mays, was the only prize that counted. Peter Burton was the other half of the dream, and a stranger half it would be hard to invent. Born in Burma, educated at Christ's Hospital, he had entered the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell as a young man and resigned his commission after a flying accident. He had no formal engineering training whatsoever. What he had was imagination, ambition, and a personality that the historian Doug Nye would later describe, with evident relish, as a spectacularly amoral and fascinating character, an independent free spirit in almost every sense of the phrase. Historians still argue over whether Burton was a brilliant intuitive engineer or a gifted dilettante who borrowed other men's ideas and copied them badly. During the development of the new car, he would live in a flat inside the control tower of a disused airfield at Folkingham, a detail so eccentric it seems invented. His private life, involving a former club dancer of formidable reputation, was as colourful as his engineering was reckless. These were the two men, the charmer and the free spirit, who left ERA in 1939 and formed a small firm they called Automobile Developments. Through the long years of the war, while the country fought for its life, they planned. They planned a British Grand Prix car built in the grand manner of the German state teams that had humiliated them. And a month or two before victory in Europe, before the guns had even fallen silent across the continent, Raymond Mays sat down and did the thing he did best. He wrote letters, letter after letter, to the leaders of British industry, pitching a national Grand Prix team that would restore the country's honour on the track. Work began where the ERAs had been built, in the old maltings behind Eastgate House in Bourne. Automobile Developments changed its name to something grander, something that told you exactly how large the ambition had grown. It became British Racing Motors. The dream now had a name. What it needed was money, and a way of raising it that no racing team had ever tried before. Chapter 4. Built by Committee. The way they chose to raise it would decide everything. On the 25th of April, 1947, they formed the British Motor Racing Research Trust. The idea was pure maize, and in its way, rather beautiful. Britain could not afford a state racing team like Germany's, so Britain's industry would build one together. Firms up and down the country would contribute, in cash or in kind, in parts and labour and expertise, to fund what everyone simply called the Maize Project. It would be a national effort, a car built by the whole trade, carrying the pride of British engineering as a shared inheritance. The response was extraordinary. BRM's own records credited active, practical support from 160 firms in the motor and allied trades. Other accounts put the number of suppliers, at its widest, as high as 350, and the names were the aristocracy of British industry. Rolls-Royce would design the supercharger. Joseph Lucas would handle the electrics. Girling would supply the brakes. Lockheed the suspension struts. David Brown the gears. English Steel the crankshaft. Standard Motors would do machining and, through a designer named Walter Belgrove, style the body. Tony van der Velde would provide his famous thin-wall bearings, and one industrialist in particular, a man named Alfred Owen, was among the very first to say yes, putting in £1,000 and offering free parts and services besides. Remember that name. He will matter more than any of them. Mays projected a programme costing over £120,000 across 4 years, a colossal sum in a country counting out its bread by the ounce. As for the government, the state whose honour this was all meant to defend, its sole contribution was the loan of a disused Royal Air Force airfield at Folkeingham, to be used for testing. Petrol and prestige the nation could not spare. A cracked concrete runway it could manage. And here, buried in the goodwill and the patriotism, was the flaw that would eventually swallow the whole enterprise. Because a car built by the whole of British industry was also, inevitably, a car run by a committee of the whole of British industry. By the end of 1947, the project answered to an 11-member main committee, and beneath it sat separate committees for production, for finance and planning, and for publicity. Decisions that a single determined engineer might have made in an afternoon now had to travel through layers of well-meaning men, each with his own firm's interests to protect. Set that against the reality of the people actually doing the work. Peter Bertham's entire design staff amounted to 4 designers and 3 draftsmen, 7 men drawing the most ambitious racing engine in the world, while committees deliberated above them, and the work, in one historian's flat and devastating phrase, had to start in a derelict barn. 160 firms behind them, 350 suppliers at the outer edge, 4 committees of the great and the good, and 7 men in a barn, trying to invent the future by hand. At the centre of the ambition sat the supercharger, and the supercharger is where the story becomes, briefly, magnificent. For this, BRM turned to Rolls-Royce, and specifically to the knowledge that had made the Merlin and the Griffon Aero engines the most powerful piston engines of the war, the engines that had powered the Spitfire and the Lancaster. Rolls-Royce generated its first internal report on the idea in November 1945, within months of the war's end. The scheme was approved at the highest level by Lord Hives himself in February 1947. The specialists assigned to it in the firm's compressor section were a Professor Allen and an engineer named, wonderfully, Oscar Wilde. Notably, the most famous supercharger man of all, Stanley Hooker, was not involved. He was busy building the jet engines that were about to change the world. The plan was to take the two-stage centrifugal supercharging that had wrung ever more power from the Merlin at high altitude and apply it to a tiny racing engine at sea level. It was aviation technology, war-winning technology, repurposed for peacetime glory. Rolls-Royce even designed a sophisticated device, a variable swirl inlet, a kind of throttle that could tame the way the boost arrived. But that device was never fitted to the racing car, blocked by breathing problems elsewhere in the engine. It was a smaller mission, buried in a technical note. It would turn out to be fateful. The dream, in the spring of 1947, was intact and glittering, the finest firms in Britain, the engineers of the Merlin, a trust that had rallied a whole industry. All that remained was to build the thing, and the thing they built was, without question, one of the most extraordinary engines ever conceived. Chapter 5. 16. Coffee cups. To grasp how audacious the BRM engine was, you have to hold two facts in your head at the same time. The whole engine displaced just 1.5 litres, smaller than the engine in a modest family car today. And into that 1.5 litres, BRM put 16 cylinders. 16. Where a rival might use 8, or 6, or 4, BRM chose 16, arranged in a wide V with the two banks of cylinders set at 135 degrees to each other. Think of it as two little V8 engines of 3/4 of a litre each, joined back-to-back on a common crankshaft carried in 10 bearings, with the power taken out from the middle rather than the end. Because 16 cylinders squeezed into 1.5 litres meant each cylinder displaced under 100 cubic centimetres. The pistons were minuscule, twee coffee cup size, in Doug Nye's unforgettable description. Little domed cups of aluminium, dancing up and down thousands of times a second. The bore of each cylinder was under 50 millimetres. 2 valves apiece, 32 valves in all, held shut by delicate hairpin springs. 4 separate magnetos to feed the sparks. And when you added up every component in the whole machine, you arrived at a number that tells you everything about the mind that made it. Around 36,000 individual parts, some 4,000 of them in the engine alone. A racing car of the era might be a triumph of clever simplicity. This was a triumph of the opposite instinct entirely. This was complexity pursued as a virtue. 16 cylinders chosen partly because 16 cylinders would astonish the backers and the press. Sitting atop all this was the Rolls-Royce blower, spinning at 4 times the speed of the crankshaft, faster than the original plan had ever intended. And now we come to the numbers that have grown taller with every retelling, and which honesty requires us to cut back down to size. You will hear that the BRM produced over 600 horsepower in 1950. It is a wonderful figure. It is also, for that year, a fiction. Raymond Mays, the showman, spoke habitually of 600 horsepower, because 600 was a number that sold the dream. But BRM's own written specification, drawn up in December 1949, promised maximum power merely in excess of 400 horsepower. The original design target, back in 1947, had been a modest 300. Enough, it was hoped, to beat the Italian Alfa Romeos, and the real figure when the car began racing in 1950 was around 330 horsepower. Genuine and considerable, but a long way short of the legend. The truth is that the power did climb, over years of desperate development, towards something like the myth. By 1951, it was making around 460. At the French circuit of Albi, in 1953, with the supercharger pumping some 72 pounds per square inch of boost, an almost unimaginable pressure, one car was claimed to be producing 585 horsepower and touching 186 miles an hour. Later development pushed the boost as high as 80 or 85 pounds, with dyno figures quoted at 612, even 625. But the soberest verdict, from the historians who counted most carefully, is that around 485 horsepower was the real absolute maximum the engine ever made, and that it never made even that under actual racing conditions. The 600 horsepower of legend was always a target, a boast, a dream, not a thing achieved on a starting grid. But if the power figures were inflated, the sound was not. The sound was, if anything, impossible to overstate. It has been called simply the greatest noise in the history of motorsport, an ear-splitting 16-cylinder scream at a pitch and volume never matched before or since. It was so violent that it reputedly distracted seasoned drivers in the cars alongside it on the grid. When the great Alberto Ascari raced against the BRMs at Albi, he complained that their noise had left him almost unable to hear anything else while he was driving. One spectator remembered his father describing how you could follow the car around the entire circuit by ear alone, hearing every single gear change over the din of every other car on the track. The machine that could not reliably finish a race could, without effort, silence a crowd of thousands and then deafen it. This, then, was the golden age of the BRM. Not a golden age of victories, for there were almost none, but a golden age of pure, luminous ambition. A work of engineering art of a kind Britain had never attempted. Power density that Formula One would not see again until the turbocharged 1980s. The engineers of the Merlin lending their genius. 160 firms lending their pride. It was, on paper and in the imagination, everything the nation had hoped for. The engine first ran late in 1949. Raymond Mays himself drove the car on one of its earliest outings, running a high fever, unwilling to let anyone else take the moment from him. And when the machine was finally shown to the public and the press, the reaction was rapture. A Pathé newsreel captured the mood exactly, in the plummy, confident voice of the age. Seldom, it declared, has so much money been better spent. In the BRM, Britain has found a winner. Britain had found a winner. That is what the newsreel said in the spring of 1950, with the whole country listening and hoping. It had not. Chapter 6. Bloody rotten motors. The trouble was, the winner could not yet get to the races. The parts came from 160 firms, and 160 firms sent their parts when they had the spare capacity to make them, not when BRM needed them. In a country living by the creed of export or die, a racing car sat at the very bottom of every supplier's list. Toolroom time went to things that could be sold abroad. And so, the great national project, announced with such fanfare, simply failed to appear. The engine had first run in December 1949. The car was, by any honest reckoning, roughly 3 years late before it turned a wheel in anger. It was supposed to make its debut before royalty. At the British Grand Prix at Silverstone in May 1950, the very first round of the very first Formula One World Championship, Princess Elizabeth and the Duke of Edinburgh were among the crowd. The BRM was there, but it was not fit to race. It appeared only as a demonstration. A lap or two to show the flag, the winner Britain had been promised reduced to a rolling exhibit, while Italian cars won the race. Then came the pressure to actually compete. The Trust had backers to satisfy. The Daily Express, which sponsored the big August meeting at Silverstone, had printed a glossy brochure trumpeting the car's arrival. So BRM was pushed, cajoled, pressured into racing at the International Trophy on the 26th of August 1950. Ready or not? It was not ready. Only one car could be made fit, and it was flown up from Folkeingham on the very morning of the race. It missed practice entirely. The organisers, bending the rules for the national hope, allowed the French star Raymond Sommer to take it out for 3 proving laps and then start from the very back of the grid. The crowd, tens of thousands strong, had come in part to see this. The car they had paid for, the car the newsreels had promised them. The flag dropped, and the BRM, the pride of British industry, the machine built by 160 firms and the engineers of the Merlin, lurched forward a few inches and stopped, dead. A driveshaft joint had sheared. The steel, it later emerged, had not been made to specification. The most complex racing car in the world, 36,000 parts of national ambition, had been defeated on the start line by a single failed piece of metal before it had travelled its own length. What happened next is the moment that defined the car for a generation. The crowd, which had come to cheer, began to boo. And then, in an act of contempt that still stings to read about, some of them threw coins at the stricken machine and its bewildered driver. As one account records it, the partisan crowd even threw coins at the car and its stricken driver, Raymond Sommer. The following day, the newspapers had their joke ready. BRM, they said, stood for bloody rotten motors. Doug Nye, the Marque's own historian, renders the jibe a shade more gently, blooming rotten motor. But the wound was the same either way. The national symbol had become the national joke, and it had taken about 4 seconds. There is a cruelty within the cruelty. Raymond Summer, the man in the cockpit that day, had lived this exact humiliation once before. 3 years earlier, he had been driving the CTA Arsenal, France's own great national racing hope, when it too had failed on the start line at Lyon and refused to move. Of that French debacle, the autocar had written that a worse debut could not be imagined. Now the same driver, in another nation's dream car, had proven them wrong. A worse debut could be imagined. He had just given it. And yet, and this is the recurring heartbreak of the whole story, the car was not slow. It was never slow. A month after Silverstone at Goodwood in September, in the rain, Reg Parnell took a BRM and won both the Woodcote Cup and the Goodwood Trophy. The thing could go. Parnell said as much afterwards, with the careful optimism of a man who had felt the machine's real potential through his hands. All we need now, he said, is a little longer time to develop it, and then we hope to show the continent what we really can do. A little longer time. It was always a little longer time. The promise was always just over the next hill, always one more season away. That was the tragedy of the BRM in a single sentence. It was fast enough to break your heart, and never reliable enough to mend it. Chapter 7. Courage and Catastrophe. To understand why it broke so many hearts, you have to understand what it was actually like to drive. Remember that Rolls-Royce supercharger, spinning at 4 times engine speed. On an ordinary supercharged engine, the power builds and then tails away as the revs climb. On the BRM, it did the opposite. The centrifugal blower meant that the harder the engine spun, the harder it pushed, the torque climbing and climbing towards the top of the range, so that the power did not arrive so much as detonate. It came in a single violent explosion high in the rev band, at a moment, and a ferocity no human foot could modulate. Tony Rudd, the Rolls-Royce engineer who would spend 20 years wrestling with this machine, put it as plainly as anyone ever has. They had, he said, an engine as powerful as a modern, non-turbo Formula One car, trying to put its power down through a pair of tyres, the same size as those on a Formula Ford. The result was a car that could spin its wheels in top gear. Not in first, clawing off the line, in fourth, at speed, on a dry road. The driver's job was not to use the power but to survive it, keeping the engine trapped in a narrow band and stirring the gearbox ceaselessly to stay there, forever a heartbeat away from the explosion that would break traction and pitch the car sideways. It was, one of the greatest drivers who ever lived would later say, a terrifying piece of machinery. He was not exaggerating, and even the men brave enough to master the power could not save themselves from the machine's other cruelties. The engine itself was at war with its own boost pressure. The joint between the cylinder head and the block simply could not survive the pressures being forced through it. It warped, it lifted, coolant wept into the cylinders and shattered the tiny cast-iron liners. There was persistent misfiring at 11,000 revolutions per minute. There were, in Rudd's grim catalogue, major failures in which the piston, the connecting rod and the liner in at least one cylinder would be totally destroyed, the engine shattering itself from the inside out. In the worst periods, the car needed attention every 20 miles or so, and a full overhaul every 150 to 200. A racing car that must be rebuilt more often than a family saloon is serviced is not a racing car. It is a beautiful, screaming liability. All of this came to its sharpest point on the 14th of July, 1951, at the British Grand Prix. It would be the only World Championship Grand Prix the V16 ever contested, and BRM, true to form, arrived late. The cars missed practice. They missed qualifying. They were pushed onto the grid at the very back, 19th and 20th. Reg Parnell and Peter Walker climbed aboard and simply drove, hauling those violent machines up through the field, Parnell to 5th, Walker to 7th. They paid for it with their bodies. The exhaust pipes on the V16 had been routed inside the bodywork, and over the length of a Grand Prix, the cockpits became ovens. Both men suffered burns, to their hands, their feet, their shins, and burns dressings had to be applied during the pit stops, the mechanics bandaging the drivers so they could get back in and keep going. Parnell finished 5 laps behind the winning Ferrari of Gonzalez and scored the only 2 World Championship points the V16 would ever earn in its entire existence. 2 points paid for in blistered skin. It is one of the quietly heroic performances in British motor racing, and almost nobody remembers it. Then, at Monza that September, the pattern repeated in its purest form. A gearbox was on the point of seizing. Both cars had to be withdrawn, and there is a small telling detail in the wreckage of that weekend. The team wanted the mechanic and test driver Ken Richardson to drive one of the cars, the man who knew the machine as well as anyone alive. The Royal Automobile Club refused to grant him a license, on the grounds that he had insufficient racing experience. So the seat went to a late substitute, the German veteran Hans Stuck, and then the gearbox failed anyway. Brave men, punished again and again by a brilliant machine. That was the shape of it. But the deepest wound the BRM ever suffered was not inflicted by any rival, or any component, or any exhaust pipe. It was self-inflicted, and it happened not on a racetrack at all, but in the mind of one man, dazzled by a name. Chapter 8. The Own Goal. By the start of 1952, there was, at last, a plan, and on paper it was the right one. Alfa Romeo, the great dominant force of early Formula One, had withdrawn from the championship. That left Ferrari more or less unopposed, and it left the organisers of the world's Grand Prix races with a problem. They needed someone to give Ferrari a fight, or the racing would be a procession. BRM, with its screaming, improving, genuinely fast V16, was the obvious answer. On the 18th of January 1952, BRM issued a press release announcing its intention to compete with a full team of cars in all the season's Grand Prix. In February, Earl Howe confirmed that the season's opening race at Turin on the 6th of April would run to Formula One rules. Rules the V16 was built for. This was the moment. This was the season the dream was finally going to be tested against the world. And then Raymond Mays threw it all away, for love of a name. The name was Juan Manuel Fangio, the finest driver on earth, and suddenly, that spring, available to be signed. Mays became, in Doug Nye's precise word, mesmerised. Here was the chance to put the greatest driver in the world in the greatest sounding car in the world. Fangio could come to England to test the machine, but only in a narrow window at the very end of March and the start of April. The exact window in which the team needed to be preparing for Turin. Mays chose Fangio. He ordered the cars brought home from their testing at Monza so that Fangio could try them in England, and he cancelled the Turin entry. The team, by the accounts that survive, came home mutinous, furious that the season's chance had been abandoned for a photo opportunity, however glittering. The bitterest detail of all is what Fangio himself is said to have thought of it. He would, according to Nye, have been perfectly happy to test the car another time. The sacrifice had not even been necessary. The consequences arrived like a landslide. Turin, deprived of its intended opposition, became exactly the Ferrari walkover the organisers had feared, the red cars finishing first, second and third. And the national motorsport clubs of the world, watching BRM fail to turn up to the very race it had promised to contest, drew their conclusion. If the supercharged Formula One cars would not, or could not appear, then the championship would be run to different rules. They confirmed that the World Championships of 1952 and 1953 would be contested under Formula 2 regulations. 2-litre cars without superchargers. At a stroke, the supercharged 1.5-litre BRM V16 was rendered ineligible for the very championship it had been conceived, funded and built to win. Forix, the racing historians, put it with merciless economy. BRM, they wrote, had scored a clinching own goal. The car had not been beaten. It had not been outdeveloped or outspent or outthought by a rival. It had been made obsolete by its own founder's inability to resist a famous face. Word of the machine's temperament was spreading now among the men who mattered most, the drivers. After a disaster at the Ulster Trophy at Dundrod in June 1952, where both cars failed, the young Stirling Moss, already recognised as the coming force of British racing, wrote to Mays and refused to drive the car in the state it was in. His verdict, set down later in his own writing, is the most quotable indictment the BRM ever received. It was, he said, unstable on the straight and impossible to drift in corners. A terrible, not to say terrifying, piece of machinery. The brakes were fine, he allowed, and the acceleration was incredible, right up until you broke traction. But everything else he hated. The steering, the driving position. As for the handling, he could not remember it having any. And then there was Tony van der Velde. The thin-wall bearing magnate had been one of the earliest and most generous backers of the trust, but he had grown steadily, corrosively disgusted with what he saw as management by committee, the very structure Mays had been so proud of. The final rupture came when an engine failure was blamed, publicly, on bearing failure. Van der Velde's bearings. He was incandescent. His bearings could hardly be blamed, he pointed out, if they were not being fed oil in the first place. He initiated legal action against Mays. He resigned from the trust, and he set out, in a fury, to do the thing himself, to build his own car and prove that a Briton could beat the world without a committee to slow him down. He called it Van Wall, and in 1958, Van Wall would win the very first Formula One Constructors' Championship, achieving the exact dream BRM had been founded to achieve, years before BRM itself managed it. The committee that was meant to build Britain's champion had instead driven away the one backer who would build it first. There is no crueler irony in the whole affair. Chapter 9. The Rescue and the Reprieve. By the summer of 1952, the money was gone and the faith was gone with it. The public had cheered, then jeered, then lost interest. The backers had watched their national dream become a punchline. On the 15th of August, 1952, the British Motor Racing Research Trust admitted defeat and offered the whole project for sale. And now comes the moment that tells you the fates were not merely indifferent to the BRM. They were actively laughing at it. Because 1 week after the trust threw in the towel at a minor meeting at Turnberry, the V16 won its first race since 1950, Reg Parnell again, and in September at Goodwood, the fearsome Argentine José Froilán González, the man they called the Pampas Bull, the only driver who seemed to actively enjoy wrestling the beast, headlined a run of victories, including a BRM 123. The car came good, truly good, in the very weeks its creators were signing its death warrant. It was fast enough to win at last, and there was no longer any championship for it to win anything in. The buyer, when he came, was the only bidder, and he was the right man. On the 23rd of October, 1952, the trust accepted an offer of £23,500 from the industrial group belonging to Alfred Owen. From the 1st of November, BRM became a division of Rubery Owen, and Owen and his siblings Ernest and Jean took the whole troubled enterprise onto their own shoulders. Sir Alfred Owen was a remarkable man to inherit a screaming folly. He was chairman and joint managing director of what has been described as the largest private family business in Britain, a man who sat on the boards of 99 companies and chaired more than 80 of them. He was also a lay reader in the Anglican Church, a man of deep and genuine faith, described by one who knew the story well as patient to the point of saintliness. He had been among the very first to back the Mays project, with his £1,000 and his offer of free parts, years before. Now, when everyone else had walked away, he simply picked the whole thing up and carried it. Where the committee had failed, one determined man, and his family, would try. For a while the V16 lived on. In the reduced world of the races it was still allowed to enter. Formula Libre events and sprint races, mostly on secondary British circuits. And in that world, freed at last of the championship it could never contest, it finally showed what it might have been. Ken Wharton, the 4 times British hill climb champion and one of the era's great all-rounders, took a string of wins through 1953. At Albi in France that year, Fangio, who had finally driven the thing after all, won his heat at above the lap record before throwing a tyre tread in the final. The same driver who had cost the car its championship was now winning heats in it. Across its whole strange life, the V16 started 73 times in 45 races, taking 19 firsts, 14 seconds and 8 thirds against 24 retirements. It looks, written down like that, almost like the record of a successful car. But as the historians are careful to note, nearly all of those results came in insignificant sprint races on minor British circuits. Trophies won in an empty room, long after the world had stopped watching. The competence had arrived. The vindication had arrived. They had simply arrived years too late to matter, at a party everyone else had already left. Fangio, for his part, never quite stopped loving the monster. It was, he once said, basically the best Formula One car ever made. All it needed was improvement in certain details. No car, he insisted, had ever given him such a thrill to drive, or a greater sense of absolute mastery. That was the BRM to the end, capable of inspiring the greatest driver alive to speak of absolute mastery, and equally capable of hurling coins worth of contempt back at the nation that built it. It was never one thing, it was always both. Chapter 10. What remains? The dream did come true in the end. That is the strangest part. Alfred Owen kept faith with BRM long after the V16 was retired, rebuilding the team into a proper racing constructor for the new era. He was not infinitely patient. In 1961, he told them, in effect, to win or close, but he gave them the chance the trust never could: clear ownership, a single guiding hand, and a professional engineer, given real authority. That engineer was Tony Rudd, the Rolls-Royce man who had come to nurse the supercharger back in 1951 and never left. Under Rudd's technical control, with Mays and Berthon at last gently moved aside from the decisions, BRM built a clean, conventional V8 car, and in 1962, Graham Hill won the Drivers' World Championship and BRM won the Constructors' title. Britain had its champion. The honour that Raymond Mays had chased since before the war was finally fully restored. But it was not restored by the V16. The screaming 16-cylinder wonder, the machine the whole thing had been built around, never won a single championship Grand Prix, and never would. The dream was fulfilled, displaced onto a quieter, simpler, better car, driven by a man who was still a mechanic in a garage when the V16 first ran. The V16 got everything it was promised: the glory, the title, the vindication of British engineering. It just did not get to be the car that delivered it. So, what is left of it now? Very little, and everything. Only one complete V16 of the original type survives in the world, the cherished car at the National Motor Museum at Beaulieu, the very machine Reg Parnell drove to fifth in that burning British Grand Prix of 1951, kept in running order by Doug Hill. A second car and a later variant sit in the Donington collection, still in their pale green, one engine cut away so you can peer inside at the coffee cup pistons and the thicket of tiny valves. Another was owned for years by Nick Mason, the drummer of Pink Floyd, a man who understood better than most what it meant to keep a great noise alive. It belongs now to Bernie Ecclestone, and in Bourne, where it all began, the memory refuses to die. At Hall & Hall, the firm founded by a BRM man, Rick Hall, and now run with his son Rob, they have done something almost defiant. Using some 20,000 original drawings and unused chassis numbers set aside decades ago, and with the blessing of John Owen, Sir Alfred's son, and his family, they have built brand new V16s. Continuation cars, faithful to the last bracket, made so that the sound would not vanish from the earth. They restored an original engine and ran it on the test bench, simply to prove the old design still breathed. The scream that deafened Ascari at Albi can still, if you know where to stand at Goodwood, raise the hairs on the back of your neck. In 2022, 70 years after Gonzalez won there, a V16 raced again at the Goodwood Revival. Walk through Bourne today, and the traces are everywhere and nowhere. Eastgate House still stands, with its plaque. The maltings where the cars were built is long gone, but there is a Raymond Mays Way, and a Graham Hill Way, and a Wetherspoons pub bearing the old showman's name, and a small memorial room in the Heritage Centre where the whole improbable story is kept. In 2025, the 75th anniversary of that ruinous racing debut, the town threw a celebration that drew 25,000 people. They did not come to mourn a failure. They came for the sound, because in the end, that is what the BRM V16 was, and is. Not a winner. It never learned how to be that when it mattered. Not quite a folly either, because a true folly teaches nothing, and this one taught a nation a hard lesson about ambition running ahead of judgment, about the difference between what a committee can dream and what a committee can build. It was a magnificent mistake, a war-weary country's cry that it could still make something the world would envy. And it did make something the world would envy, only it was the noise, not the victory. The floors at Beaulieu are quiet now. The car sits behind its rope, cold and perfect and pale green. And somewhere in the ears of the men who heard it live, 70 years on, it is still screaming.